Hey everybody, it's Scott Shetler and welcome to this week's episode of Strength and Health TV. This week I want to talk about kind of a controversial topic in the world of strength and conditioning. I want to talk about using strength and conditioning for combative athletes, boxers, mixed martial artists, jiu-jitsu, Brazilian jiu-jitsu, wrestling, all the various disciplines that compete in the combative arts. This is kind of a controversial topic because everybody seems to have various opinions. Some people go all the way to the side of the spectrum and they say that strength and conditioning for fight training is not important, that it's mostly a skill-based discipline, and that you'll get all the conditioning, all the strength training that you need through just doing the sport itself and becoming more proficient with your technique. And then some people say that it is important to add in general physical preparation through various strength and conditioning modalities to enhance the fighter and their performance. And you get everything in between as well. Even in the camp that believes that strength and conditioning methods are important, there's even disagreements as to what the optimal way to train is. And regardless of whether somebody's a fighter or whether they're a football player or a volleyball player or just any sport athlete, I believe that you can't say one thing across the board for anyone. I do think that you need general physical preparation for athletes, and I think it's also highly individualized. I think that if you're working with, say, a football team, you got a group of guys who are at different levels of physical abilities. Some might be really, really strong, some might be fast, some might have no mobility or flexibility, some might be very mobile, some might have great agility, some might be tripping over themselves. So not everybody is at the same levels of physical preparation when it comes to sports performance, and I think that's why it needs to be why we need to take a much more individualized approach when working with athletes on their physical training and their preparation for sport. That being said, I know there's situations, and this is getting a little outside the scope of what I want to talk about in this video, but I know when you're talking about some of the school sports, things that you participated in high school and college, of course the big ones like football, baseball, basketball, hockey, volleyball, things like that, you're often in a situation where you've got a strength coach who's running the strength conditioning program. You might have some grad assistants or some assistant strength coaches, and you're working in more of a group format. So it becomes harder to individualize the programming and the preparation for these athletes. And I know some that do a very good job. In fact, I think, as far as I'm concerned, Ethan Reeve at Wake Forest sets the gold standard when it comes to the strength conditioning coach profession. He does a fantastic job with the athletes. He works up there and he runs a great program. And it's not easy to work with a ton of people on their preparation when they're at various physical levels, and he has done a great job with his athletes. And if that's an area that you work in or that's something that you're interested in getting involved in, I can't recommend checking out what he does up at Wake Forest enough. The guy's absolutely brilliant, does a fantastic job with his athletes. Now, in my arena where I get to work with people individually, it's much easier when it comes to preparing the athlete because I'm working with people one-on-one or in very, very small groups where I can manipulate the training based on their individual strengths and weaknesses. I don't have to worry about working with 20, 30, 40 people or having assistants helping me out. It's much easier when it comes to programming and preparation for athletes. So for me, I believe that's more of the ideal situation. Now, chances are when we start talking about training your mixed martial artist or your fighter, that's going to be the scenario where these fighters are seeking out private trainers or private strength coaches to help them with their physical preparation to get to enhance their fighting and maybe enhance their strength, their power, their speed, whatever. So that's typically the individual that's going to work with those types of people. Now you've got to, you see a lot of these big MMA clubs where they offer a bunch of different martial arts disciplines, and then they typically have some in-house strength and conditioning, which is great. But oftentimes I see, like the fighters that I've worked with in the past, mostly Brazilian jiu-jitsu guys, but I have worked with some mixed martial artists, I've worked with some boxers, have worked with some Muay Thai, but predominantly I've worked with Brazilian jiu-jitsu players, and typically it's usually in preparation for a competition or a tournament. And it was a very educational opportunity for me to work with these people and to see the differences in their level of preparation and what's needed for them to do well at their sport and competition. And I just want to kind of share some of my views on strength conditioning and physical preparation for combative athletes. Now, first of all, I think one of the problems in the field today is that some of these people tend to be overly conditioned, and and when I say overly conditioned, I don't mean that their cardio is just at such a high level that they never get tired. That's certainly not the case. And often you see people who are very well conditioned who do gas out because I think they are lacking in other areas of physical development. But typically, when you look at the way people train their sports, I mean, particularly with MMA, where they've got to be proficient in multiple disciplines, an MMA fighter's got to attain a high level of striking. So they're going to be doing boxing or Muay Thai or kickboxing, Sanda, Sanshao, whatever. And then they've also got to have a high level of proficiency with their grappling arts. So they're going to be, whether they're wrestlers or whether they're doing Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, they've got to maintain these disciplines across the board. That in and of itself is incredibly difficult to become really, really good at the stand-up arts as well as the grappling arts, and it requires a lot of time and practice to get really, really good at that, and it's a never-ending thing. They're always trying to get better, and I believe that's where the bulk of the time should be spent, is learning technique, learning how to get better at their art or their discipline. That's going to have the greatest carryover to their performance if they choose to compete in the arena. But I do, when you look at, they're already at such a high level of cardiovascular development just through the specific sport practice itself. And then some of these guys are training for multiple hours a day. So they're getting a lot of cardio development or cardiovascular development as it is. I think there's certain areas where they can better put some focus in on their on the general prep side of the coin. And if you're familiar with the work of Joel Jamieson, I highly recommend his Ultimate Conditioning or Ultimate Training for MMA book. It's fantastic. He talks about all the different energy systems, the appropriate means for preparing those energy systems with the fighters and athletes in general. And there's a lot of great information in there. And one of the things that I've seen work really, really well for the jiu-jitsu, particularly the jiu-jitsu players that I've worked with in the past, is to incorporate the lower heart rate work, the cardiovascular development work, or the cardiac development work, where we typically work in the heart rate ranges of around 130 to 150 or so for designated period of time, 30 minutes, 45 minutes, 90 minutes even. And by working at that specific heart rate, you're not working so high that you're not allowing your heart to beat so fast that it's going to have a negative impact on your heart stroke volume. So basically what you're doing when you're working in the cardiac development range is you're trying to improve your cardiovascular efficiency by training the heart at that certain heart rate. And you really need to read up on this stuff. It's way outside the scope of the video and what I want to talk about, but that is one area that I've seen a huge impact, not only with the jiu-jitsu guys that I've worked with, but also with some of my other athletes as well. You typically see an emphasis on circuit training or interval training, high intensity intervals and things like that. And when you look at the dynamics of sparring and some of the training means that they use in the specific performance of their art, they're getting a lot of that interval training where they're going hard and backing off and going hard and backing off. So they might be working already in those heart rate ranges that elicit that sort of training response, and then they go out and they run different sprints, or they get on the aerodyne or whatever, where they're doing just more of this interval training, and it's just more and more and more, and then they're letting other areas fall by the wayside by neglecting other forms of cardiac development training, other forms of strength, power training, and such. So I think it's really important that for the coach that's working with these athletes, or the trainer that's working with these athletes, that they can identify what their fighter's lacking in, and then they can bring up those areas. And one of the most controversial areas is strength development. Because unfortunately, anytime you say the word strength, people immediately think of a super heavyweight power lifter or a super heavyweight lifter, and that's not the case. Strength is very important for all sports, and it doesn't just mean being able to put up a good bench press. It means building strength, building usable strength, and all the muscles required to perform in your given sport or competition. And it drives me crazy when you hear these people say, well, you just need technique supersedes strength, and then they use these stupid examples like take a strongman competitor and put him in the ring with an MMA fighter, and the MMA fighter's gonna wipe the ring with his ass or whatever. Of course, you're talking about two completely different disciplines. You're talking about one guy who picks up stones, clean and presses logs. He does all these different strength feats. He has no skill in the fighting arena. A better comparison would be to say, take an MMA fighter and, put him with a much stronger individual in his discipline. So take like a welterweight and put him in with a heavyweight and see what happens. Chances are, if their skills equal, the heavyweight is going to crush the smaller guy because he's stronger and can overpower him. He can hit harder, he can kick harder, because one, his body size has allowed him to attain higher levels of strength. So I know with fighting, just like with powerlifting and weightlifting and other sports that are weight class sports, wrestling, you need to often work within a certain body weight, and that's fine, but that doesn't mean that just because somebody weighs 155 pounds, they can't get insanely strong. The 155 people are capable of insane amounts of strength. And I don't think that the way that it's approached in modern day training, at least what I've been exposed to, strength is not regarded that highly. Yeah, they might do a little bit of weightlifting, or you see everybody swinging battle ropes, or maybe doing some kettlebells, and all that stuff's great for general conditioning and such. But you very rarely see a well thought out approach to getting people strong. And you look at some of the videos of Bones Jones going around in the past few months where he's been doing, and it drives me crazy when people say Bones Jones is powerlifting. He's not powerlifting. Powerlifting would indicate that he's training with the specific goal of getting on a platform and competing in a powerlifting competition. Just because the guy's doing squats, just because he's doing deadlifts and presses and such, it doesn't mean he's powerlifting. He's just using movements that typically powerlifters are going to use in preparation for their sport, because in powerlifting, doing squats and deadlifts that's sport-specific preparation. When we use barbell exercises for other athletes, it's general physical preparation because we're using that modality to build strength. And when you talk about working up, and a lot of people criticize well, he's working up to a heavy 1-rep max. So many people are afraid of the 1-rep max, it drives me crazy. But in a weight class dominant sport, he might not be able to afford to put on a lot of extra muscle mass, and typically you're not going to be able to put on a lot of extra muscle mass. A lot of these guys have to cut to make their weight class anyway. Why would he want to put on extra unnecessary muscle mass that he's not going to need, and it's going to make it harder for him to cut to maintain his weight class? It's stupid. But by doing heavy singles, you're going to avoid the hypertrophy response that goes along with these exercises. Take, for instance, the squat. If you work up to a 1-rep max in the squat, the time under tension is very low, probably right around 2 to 5 seconds, maybe. Well, now if you take, say, 60% of somebody's 1-rep max and you have them do a 20-rep set, that set's going to take a long time to complete. The time under tension is probably going to be, somewhere in the 45 to 60 second range. And now you're creating a great environment for muscular hypertrophy. So in my opinion, these fighters and people that need to maintain their weight class, it's more desirable to do heavyweight lower rep training, just because it keeps them from adding unnecessary muscle mass. And then the benefits that you get when you exceed 90% of a 1-rep max, the inter and intramuscular coordination, those are all the benefits that can be derived from performing maximal effort strength work. And I don't believe that the maximal effort method should be the only thing that fighters should focus on, but I think it can be very, very beneficial for fighters to do various types of pulls and various types of squats in that maximal effort range. Some of my exercises that I would select would be things like rack pulls, where you're doing partial deadlifts out of the rack, doing Zercher squats where you're holding a barbell in the crook of your elbows and squatting down to pick up the barbell off the rack pins. These movements not only strengthen the legs and help build the leg drive, but they also strengthen the back. When you think about going down for like a double leg, or when you're on your back and you're doing a bridge, having the ability to extend the hips is very important. So a strong back is crucial. And for the maximal effort method, these are fantastic exercises that can be implemented, I think, utilized very effectively. So things like sumo deadlifts, things like deadlifts out of the rack, various types of good mornings from a dead stop, out of the straps or off the pins of the power rack, and various types of Zercher type squats, I think, are all fantastic choices for the high weight, low rep, 90% or better lifting that happens when you're utilizing the max effort method. And I would do those movements for single reps, just again, no more than 3s, but when you're doing 3s, you're really not doing a maximal effort. So I see no problem with working up in the 1 rep maxes. I think there's a lot of benefits to be derived from utilizing the maximal effort method for fighters, and I think it's one of the great ways that they can incorporate strength training into the regimen, and I think they should do it and spend some time doing it. And the other method I think would be very beneficial for fighters is speed, strength, and power development. Speed strength, often referred to as the dynamic effort method, is a great way to train because what you're focusing on is improving rate of force production with a specific volume prescribed to it. Typically, in terms of powerlifting, we're usually talking in terms of about 75 to 85% of a 1 rep max being the optimal range for speed strength work. One of my mentors, Louis Simmons, the Westside Barbell Club, uses 50 to 60% bar weight with another 25% in accommodating resistance, usually in the form of attaching heavy bands to the bar. The bands create a virtual force on the person that's lifting, which creates more kinetic energy during the movement and creates more force potential during the lifting phase. So there are a lot of benefits to utilizing the elastic form of accommodating resistance, and when you're trying to increase power, that is a great method to implement. So doing things like box squats, doing things like speed deadlifts with the appropriate rep ranges and the appropriate loading, I think is a great thing that fighters can utilize and take advantage from. Even doing the speed bench presses to help improve rate of force production in the triceps, the shoulder, and the chest can be beneficial in my opinion. So even though the bench press is an exercise I don't think is crucial for fighters to do, I think when done for speed strength work, and I think one-arm dumbbell bench pressing, there's some benefit to doing that as well. But for the most part, outside of that, I focus more on push-ups, doing things like maybe laying on the glute ham, raise in a sit-up position, holding a band in each hand attached to the base of the rack, and doing alternating punches to help build the torso. Rotation and anti-rotation of the torso is a fantastic exercise. So there's ways you can incorporate presses. I think kettlebell clean and presses or clean and jerks are really good movements to do. So there are ways. I think you do need to spend some time pressing, but I think in regards to the dynamic effort method, doing things like box squats against bands, doing things like speed deadlifts against bands are really beneficial when we're talking about improving rate of force production from general exercise means. We're trying to do in the weight room is to try to make the athlete as strong and as fast as possible, but to the point that it is not deterring from their ability to perform their sport. All right, so I think that's the key when you're talking about strength training, and where the disconnect is for a lot of people. Again, going back to that example, they think the minute you say strength, they're talking about becoming a big super heavyweight, weightlifter, and that's not the case. What we want to do is make them as strong as possible in their weight class, and you'd be able to maintain that weight. So what we're really trying to improve is what's called mass-specific force, and what that is the amount of force that they can produce based on their body's mass. And really what it is, it's getting stronger without getting bigger. In a nutshell, if you're into training athletes, I recommend the book, and I talked about it in one of my earlier videos. It was recommended to me by Louis Simmons when I was visiting Westside Barbell to do some training with myself and some of my athletes. He recommended this book called The Underground Secrets to Faster Running by I think it's written by Barry Ross, I believe. And Ross is a strength coach, works with track and field athletes, and he talks about the importance of mass-specific force for these athletes to get them faster. So basically what you're trying to do is increase the engine's output without making the engine any bigger. And I think that's something of great concern when you're talking about these sports that need to stay in weight classes. And the other thing is, too, when we're talking about strength, so many people say strength isn't important to fighters. One of my good friends, Brian, who was a former training partner of mine, he brought up a really good point. We were training one day and we were talking about this. We're talking about is strength important for fighters? Is it not important for fighters? And he used to manage a fight gym here in Atlanta, and he really simplified it by saying, Scott, if strength wasn't important to fighters, why are so many guys getting popped for steroids? I'd be willing to bet it's not because they want to look good walking out to the ring, but because anabolics offer some great benefits when you're talking about things like recovery and restoration, as well as the ability to improve strength and power. So that's why athletes use them. In a nutshell, they use them to get stronger. So why are these fighters who, if strength isn't important, why are so many MMA fighters getting popped for using anabolics? Just something to think about, and pretty common sense. So strength, again, speed strength and power. Power would be doing things like jumps, throws with light medicine balls, things where you're talking about absolute, power production, jumps onto boxes, and things of that nature. Maybe running some sprints and things like that can help develop power. Some other aspects of training that we talked a little bit about the cardiovascular training. You've got aerobic training and anaerobic training, which definitely needs to be addressed, but don't overlook the aerobic development and the anaerobic development that occurs through the specific sport practice itself. Like I said, in the past with the people that I've worked with, most of them derived more benefit from focusing on aerobic development through the cardiac development prescriptions where you're working in the lower heart rate ranges, and they were getting plenty of the interval training or the anaerobic work just through the specific practice of the sport itself. So keep that in mind. Do not overlook what's already being done in the specificity phases and the specificity training sessions of the fighter. And then of course you have flexibility and mobility. All athletes need a certain amount of active and passive range of motion to perform their sport, some more than others. Obviously a boxer isn't going to need the same levels of flexibility as a gymnast who does the rings, right? So you need to be able to assess the degree to which flexibility and mobility is important for your athlete, and then implement the correct means through joint mobility, through passive and active stretching methods and things like that. So there's many different physical qualities, not just strength, that's important to fighters as well as all other athletes. But to say that fighters don't need to spend time building strength is completely ridiculous in my opinion. You know, I mean, if you've got two people at the same skill level, the stronger guy's probably going to win. You know, I'd worked with this one of the jiu-jitsu players that I worked with in the past. He's a brown belt in BJJ now, but when he was living here in Atlanta, he was I think he had just gotten his purple belt, and he decided he wanted to start competing. And his first event, or his first tournament that I trained him for, was, I think it was a Grappler's Quest tournament that was up here in North Georgia. And he was weighing, I want to say somewhere in the high 200 and teens, like maybe 218 to about 222, somewhere around there. I can't remember just off the top of my head, but it was in that ballpark. So he was in one of the heavier weight classes. So he had entered to compete both in the no-gi and the gi divisions of this jiu-jitsu tournament. And I remember the guy that I watched a couple of his matches because I was up at this fitness expo that was going on at the same time. And I remember one of Jason's matches, this guy that he beat they did no-gi first. In the no-gi division, this guy was massive. I mean, he looked like a bodybuilder, a power lifter. I mean, he was huge. He had huge delts, arms, pecs. You could see his abs through his rash guard that he was wearing. I mean, the guy was jacked. He looked ginormous. And in the no-gi division, Jason beat him and won his division in the no-gi competition. But in the gi competition, this guy just manhandled Jason, you know, like it was nothing. And I was like, you know, it was just beyond me why he could just cream this guy in the no-gi division, but in the gi division, he didn't stand a chance. And we were talking after the tournament, and I was asking about that guy because this guy he didn't look like your typical martial artist. This guy, like I said, he was yoked. And when I was talking to Jason, when I was asking him about that, you know, his skill obviously as a jiu-jitsu artist was much better. But when they got to in the no-gi division, he was able to rely on his skill to compensate. You know, Jason don't get me wrong, Jason's a very strong guy. We did a lot of strength and power training, so he wasn't going in there with no strength. His strength levels were really high and his technique was really high, and that's what allowed him to win in the no-gi division. But in the gi division, this guy that he was grappling was able to lock down on the lapels of his gi and just sink him in there and just hold him and prevent him from going anywhere and manhandling him. And it just prevented Jason from being able to do anything. And he told me that the strength and the power this guy was generating, having that leverage of using the gi against Jason, it was just he couldn't do anything, you know. So there's a prime example of where having high levels of strength is beneficial. You know, this guy lost to Jason in no-gi, but he was able to beat him. You know, he lost to him when technique was more the issue, but when strength was more the issue, he beat Jason very easily and won the gi tournament. So Jason had made the decision to cut body weight and trim down to about 180 pounds, and when he did, he started doing much better across the board. He was able to maintain those high levels of strength at a much lower body weight. So dropping that 30 pounds or so that he did to get down to 180, think about that. He's taken off 30 pounds of mass. So his mass-specific force has improved dramatically. He's got 30 pounds less mass on his frame, but he's still got really high levels of strength and power, which we continue to develop through his training, and it just continued to make him that much better. And he went on to win more Naga and Grappler's Quest tournaments, and he competed at a couple of the Pan Ams and stuff. And he's went off to a really good career. I don't talk to him much anymore because he moved to Texas, but I know he's a brown belt now, and he's doing really well. And I know strength training. He had sent me some pictures of the gym that he built in his garage, and it was like a miniature extreme performance training system, which was kind of cool. So it just reinforced that the training was very effective for him, or else he wouldn't have gone and spent all that money on his own gym. And so some of the things that we did, we focused a lot on the dynamic effort work. We focused a lot on the bands, using the bands on the box squats and the various pulls. We did lots of pull-ups. I think pull-ups are a huge benefit, particularly with him. We would do gi pull-ups. We'd take a gi and we'd throw it over a pull-up bar, and he would grab onto the gi and do pull-ups. And at one point, I remember looking over, and he's hanging upside down. He's got a figure 4 lock on this gi, and he's doing upside-down pull-ups. He got very proficient. But what we were looking at there is a concept called training economy. We only had like 3 sessions a week for about an hour to do a strength training. Strength training should not make up a huge time for the combative athlete. It shouldn't take a lot of time out of their preparation. 3 1-hour sessions a week was plenty for Jason. He got a huge benefit out of it, and it wasn't taken away from his jiu-jitsu practice. So gi pull-ups were a way for us to not only build his pulling strength and his lats and his biceps and his shoulders, but it also developed a tremendous amount of grip strength, and grip strength is huge for the combat athlete. Think about the mixed martial artists. They're using those 4-ounce gloves that make grabbing even harder, because now they got something over their palm. If you ever lifted weights, try putting a glove on and trying to do a deadlift or something, you'll see it's a lot harder, and it affects your grip. So grip training is very, very important. I'm not against doing things like the grippers or doing static holds. I love the static holds. Maybe squeezing a hex dumbbell and holding it for time, or using things like the rolling thunder attachment, or working the grippers, or even doing wrist curls, reverse wrist curls to help build up the form. I think that stuff's great. But anywhere that you can impact your grip on your training is another. Using fat bars during deadlifts and things like that. Using fat bars on the pull-up bar to make your grip a lot wider. Doing the gi pull-ups, or doing rope pull-ups, rope climbing. There's so many ways that you can maximize the training economy in your programming and build some grip strength without having to do a bunch of isolation grip exercises at the end. Not that there's anything wrong with working in some specific grip work, but there's ways to get more out of your training to benefit it. So we did lots of pull-ups in addition to the dynamic effort work, the banded box squats and the speed deadlifts. We did lots of jumps onto a box, tons of jumps, weighted jumps, body weight jumps, jumps from a seated position. Jumps are fantastic for building explosive power, and we liked the box jumps because he was able to jump up and he didn't have the impact of landing. So we were able to use jumps throughout the entire training sequence and not cycle. If you look at like drop jumps or depth jumps or altitude landings where you're dropping off of a box, hitting the ground and jumping, that's a huge amount of impact on the body, and those should only be implemented at various times throughout the training year. But with jumping up onto a box, you're able to take that impact out, and he was able to do jumps longer across the board. We did a lot of work with pulling and dragging sleds, both pressing and pulling and doing different types of rotational pulls with the sled, and then doing different sprints and things against the prowler sled as well. So sled dragging, sled pulling, loaded carries, timed sets of loaded carries, where you're doing farmer's walks with odd objects, you're carrying things, and you're hugging something to your body and carrying it. Heavy medicine balls, stones, picking up some odd object is a great thing to do. Carrying a barbell in a zercher position with some weights or some kettlebells hanging off the end of the bar. Various types of loading. You got to vary this stuff up, but loaded carries are fantastic. And one of the things that we did to build specific conditioning is a lot of these movements we did in the kettlebell work was fantastic, but a lot of these movements we did for timed sets. One of the things that Jason talked about was his conditioning. When he was at Pan Am's, I think he was his matches, unless they were stopped by stoppage, if they went to decision, I think they would go for 6 minutes straight or 7 minutes straight, and then basically he would rest for a match and then he would go again. So at this tournament, he'd have to go for 6 or 7 minutes, rest for 6 or 7 minutes, go for 6 or 7 minutes, rest. And he found that by about the third or fourth match, he was getting pretty gassed. He didn't have that reserve tank, and he was really running out of steam. So one of the things that we did with a lot of his kettlebell training, where he was doing swings and cleans and clean and presses and snatches, we would just work in a bunch of different kettlebell movements and have him do 7-minute sets without setting the bell down, just switching hands as needed, and using maybe 7 different exercises for a minute each or whatever. We also worked that into some of the sled work where he'd pull for various amounts of times. That I believe that's a great modality for building specific conditioning while loading the body. Kettlebells were fantastic for that. Loaded carries and things, really, really good. So we focused on a lot of time sets where he would either go all out for 30 or 60 seconds, or he would go all out for 1 minute, 3 minutes, 5 minutes, 7 minutes, even up to 10 minutes. And that was one of the most successful things that we did to build his conditioning for his fights. So, and again, the cardiac development work was big for him. So those are just some of the different methods, and using, just one of the guys that I've worked with as an example. You got to keep in mind how much time your athlete has to commit to the training program. They might not have all day, and again, the most important thing is for them to get their specific work done at their fight club, doing their jiu-jitsu, wrestling, boxing, Muay Thai, whatever, getting all their stand-up work in. And for MMA fighters, it's much harder than for somebody who's competing in just jiu-jitsu, or they're just doing Muay Thai or just boxing, because now, instead of working one discipline and becoming very, very proficient in that one discipline, they've got to get very proficient in a bunch of different disciplines, and that takes even more training time away, because they got their boxing lessons, they got their jiu-jitsu lessons, then they got their sparring and their specific practice. So strength and conditioning, really, it can't make up a huge part of these athletes' training. So you have to be very effective, and you've got to be very efficient with what you do, and you've got to be able to identify where the athlete's weak and what they need more of. And it runs across the board. Remember, you're trying to develop strength, speed strength, absolute power, aerobic development, anaerobic development, flexibility, mobility. There's a lot of things that you need to factor in and prep, and making sure that you're training the muscles correctly, and you're training the right muscles and working the kinetic chains correctly. There's a lot that goes into the training and preparation of athletes, and these combative athletes. It's much more than just swinging some ropes around and doing some wind sprints and throwing on a mask and running on a treadmill and hitting a tire with a sledgehammer. I mean, you've got to get really specific with how you train these people, and you've got to identify the weaknesses and build upon those weaknesses. And I think in this specific industry, it's very, very overlooked. I think one of the problems is a lot of times fight coaches want to wear all the hats, and they think they know about training. They really don't have much of a scientific background when it comes to training athletes from the general physical preparation standpoint. And to me, it's a disservice to the athlete if you're not prepared. That'd be like me, who's got no skill whatsoever in jiu-jitsu or Muay Thai or whatever, trying to train somebody on fighting or tell them how to do their fight training. It's completely moronic. I'm a special strength conditioning specialist. I work with people on their general physical preparation. That's where I do really, really well. I'm not going to go in and tell a fight coach how to program their fight training for their athletes. That's completely ridiculous. And I think it's the same when a fight coach who does not have a background in training, or just uses like CrossFit or something like that, and throws that into their athletes planning. I think that's a disservice to the athlete, because I think they're probably most likely missing out on a lot of specific development that they need, because their weaknesses haven't been identified and all their physical abilities have not been developed. Just a few certain physical abilities are emphasized to the detriment of the others. And when you're trying to perform at a high level, you need to make sure all your bases are covered, and that's very hard to do with such a difficult discipline like the mixed martial arts or the combative arts. So those are just some of my opinions. I think I covered everything I wanted to talk about. I'll probably do some articles and doing some follow-up on this, just because it is such a hot topic in the strength conditioning industry, and everybody has an opinion, and it's really interesting hearing what people have to say and what their opinions are, and from people who've worked with fighters. But I'm just telling you, what I've learned through working with, again, mostly jiu-jitsu players, but I have worked with some Muay Thai, some boxing, some different types of combative athletes in the past, but it's mostly MMA fighters, but it's mostly been jiu-jitsu. And I got to tell you, implementing a smart strength and conditioning program will have a profound impact on the ability of these fighters. I mean, just look at what some of these people who take their strength and conditioning seriously are able to accomplish. I mean, look at Matt Brown, one of the top UFC fighters, I think, in the welterweight division, who did a lot of his strength training at Westside Barbell when he was in Ohio. with Tom Barry and the program up there, and it had a huge impact on his strength, on his power, and he credits the crew up there for helping him just tremendously. He says nothing but good things about what he learned. And I can tell you, when people talk about, especially in the industry, people talk about mat training at Westside or fighters using Westside methods, it's completely, it's idiotic, because they think that they're following what you would think of as the Westside Barbell powerlifting program. It's completely, totally the opposite of that. I had the pleasure of being up there when they had a group of fighters training, and I can tell you, looking at the fighters, looking at the powerlifters, they were doing two completely different things. All right, it's a completely different system for the fighters that train up there. It's a completely, I saw sprinters up there. I saw all kinds of different athletes. I took a swimmer up there, not in addition to the powerlifters that I took up there. And I can tell you, it's different training for everybody. What Louis does is he takes scientifically backed principles and applies them to the individual athlete. And I think what he's doing up there is so far ahead of what most programs are doing and what most people are doing. It's extraordinary how they've developed the program for so many different sports disciplines, and it's been very beneficial to the work that we do down here, because he's been a fantastic mentor. But when you look at the positive impact that a well thought out and a well prescribed strength program, Nick Kerson's doing some amazing things. I don't, I'm not 100% familiar with his program, but from what I've seen, he's doing some really cool things on power development and how the athlete moves. And speaking of movement, I mean, one of the big things now is these movement coaches. Again, when you talk about what these fighters, what these martial artists and athletes are getting through the practice of their sport, their discipline themselves, they're getting plenty of movement just by getting out on the mat and doing their sport and wrestling and rolling around on the ground and jiu-jitsu and their stand-up game and the footwork with fighting and stuff like that. Going and doing these movement exercises, I don't know, I guess some people it might be beneficial, but if you're at a high level in the combative sports, you're probably pretty good at movement, and you're probably lacking in some other abilities. I'm not saying it's completely ridiculous, but I just think it's funny how, movement training is all the buzzword now, and how it's kind of, looking down on strength and other forms of conditioning and things like that. But, you're getting tons of movement when you're practicing the art itself. I don't know if you need to go out and just do, bear crawls and I don't know, parkour or whatever it is. So just keep that in mind when you're developing, a well thought out strength conditioning program for any athlete. You've got to look at the athlete as an individual. You have to assess the skills required of the sport, of the discipline. You've got to assess the physical requirements of that sport, of that position, of that discipline, and you have to be able to look at what the optimal levels would be and look at your fighter or your athlete with unbiased eyes and know what needs to be brought up to bring them up to that next level of preparation. And there's so many factors that come into it. It's not just one thing. So hopefully you enjoyed this video this week, and hopefully it opened your eye, particularly if you work with fighters or you're interested in working with fighters, or maybe you're a fighter yourself or a combat athlete. Hopefully it's giving you some things to think about. Hopefully it's opened up your mind to exploring some different types of training to help improve your power, your speed, your coordination, your agility, your strength. And hopefully you'll get a little bit deeper into it. I'm always available if you want to contact me through my YouTube page here. You can leave some comments down below the video if you've got any suggestions for future topics, or if you got any questions about today's video. And you can contact me directly. I put all my contact info in the description underneath this video as well if you've got any questions about the content that we talked about today. So hopefully you found something informative in this video, and hopefully I'm a big fan of the combat sports. I'm a big fan of MMA and fighting. I think it's awesome. I think it's here to stay, and I just really hope that other strength and conditioning professionals that are interested in it will help, will go out and educate themselves and make their programs better to allow these guys, these girls, to attain higher levels of performance, because that's what it's all about. So hopefully you found some information to be in this video to be useful to you. Don't hesitate to contact me if you have any questions, and as always, stay strong and stay healthy.